Are plant-based diets nutritionally inadequate, or are meat-based diets traditionally inadequate? Well, I want to go back to an older study at the end of 2021 that suggested both might be true. I'm Dr. Brett Scherer, the medical director at dietdoctor.com, and I want to revisit this study both for the findings and sort of maybe a twist on the interpretation of the findings. It was called Nutrient Intake and Status in Adults Consuming Plant-Based Diets Compared to Meat Eaters, a systematic review, and it was published in Nutrients in 2021. And what they did was a systematic review of observational and intervention studies published between 2000 and January 2020 to assess nutrient intake and status in adult populations consuming plant-based diets, which were mainly vegetarian and vegan, with that of meat eaters. And basically what they looked at was all these studies that reported nutrient levels or nutrient intakes and which were deficient or below sort of the recommended amount, and compared plant-based versus meat. And it's not much of a surprise. So the results, at least I don't think the results are much of a surprise. So the plant-based diets had higher levels of fiber, polyunsaturated fatty acids, folate, vitamin C, vitamin E, and magnesium, with lower intake of EPA and DHA, which makes sense because those are animal-based omega-3s. Whereas they also had B12, D, iron, zinc, iodine, calcium, and bone turnover markers were lower in plant-based compared to meat eaters, with the vegan, of course, having the lowest B12, calcium, and iodine, and lower bone mineral density. And this is important on a number of different levels. I mean, look, there's a big push now for plant-based diets, but we have to be clear that a 100% plant-based diet is a nutritionally inadequate diet. Not that you can't overcome that, right? You can overcome that with supplements and with fortification. That's one thing if you're talking about the industrialized world. If you're talking about the emerging world, lower socioeconomic countries, then they don't have access to those supplements. They might not have access to the fortified foods. So they're going to be at increased risk. But it's not just, sub-Saharan Africa versus the United States or Europe. There are pockets within these so-called wealthy nations, which we are supposed to be one of. There are pockets that are very poor and aren't going to, again, have access to supplements, not going to be able to afford supplements, not going to be able to find supplements, and not going to be able to make good enough food choices and have the adequacy of the food choices to overcome these dietary inadequacies and insufficiencies. And this is a big issue with schools, especially in New York City now, going meatless Monday and vegan Fridays. And then, so the kids don't get any animal nutrition on Friday. And at home on the weekend, if they're in one of the lower socioeconomic status areas that are struggling to put food on the table, they're not going to get much nutrition over the weekend. And then they come back to school on Monday, and again, no animal nutrition. So it's low protein and low on all these nutrients that this study found. That's really concerning. So we have to acknowledge that animal products have a role in adequate nutrition. Period. Full stop. Animal products have a role in adequate nutrition. And that's really important. A study like this shows that. Okay, now what about the other side? So meat eaters had we're at risk of, I like this one, inadequate intake of fiber. Where's the fiber requirement? We don't have any minimum necessary amount of fiber. So I'm not sure what inadequate fiber even means. Or PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acids, and alpha-linoleic acid. Again, there's not a deficiency that there's going to be a problem of when you're getting plenty of healthy other omega-6s or omega-3s, from natural foods. So that's not going to be a concern. Okay, then folate, vitamin D, vitamin E, calcium, and magnesium. So D and calcium is a little surprising to me because usually meat eaters also eat plenty of dairy. So that's a little surprising. But look, of course I'm biased in this, but when I read this, certainly the deficiencies for meat eaters seems far less concerning than the deficiencies for plant-based eaters. So if you really want to target adequate nutrition, you really have to include meat in that equation. And that's, I don't see much of a way around that, especially for people who aren't going to be able to supplement, aren't going to be able to get fortified foods, aren't going to be able to make the best food choices available to them. So it's one thing for a wealthy person to make these decisions and to try and promote this for the rest of the country or the rest of the world, because they're not in that position, right? They can supplement all they want. They can have their chefs making their meals with wonderful varieties and choices that hit all their nutrient targets. Very different from your average person, even in most wealthy industrialized countries. So I thought that was very interesting, the way that brought it up. And I think it's pretty clear which side has more nutrient deficiencies that we have to be careful of. So we really have to be careful about this plant-based diet movement and what it means for nutritional inadequacies. And we're going to have a podcast with Ty Beal to talk about this even more, because he's an expert at this, and I think you really appreciate his perspective. All right, that's it for this edition of Diet Doctor News on YouTube. Thanks a lot, everybody, and we'll see you next time.